I want to say good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to ARC's Literacy Webinar Series. I'm Amelia Larson, and I serve as the EVP of Innovations and Academic Partnerships at American Reading Company. And this is my co-host, Mario. Mario?
Obrigado, Amelia. Hello, friends and professional family. My name is Mario Palma, and I recently transitioned to Vice President of Academic Partnerships, and it's my pleasure to be here. Okay, Amelia, I think it's time to introduce our esteemed guests. We are thrilled to have you with us today.
Go ahead.
First and foremost, Dr. Kelly V. Cartwright, welcome, Professor of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Teacher Preparation at Christopher Newport University. She directs the Reading Executive Function and Development Lab, affectionately known as the READ Read Lab, and is a research scholar for the Center for Education Research and Policy. Kelly studies the neurocognitive and affective factors that underlie reading processes and difficulties from preschool through adulthood. She regularly works with educators throughout the United States to better understand and improve reading, and these experiences inform her research. Secondly, we have Ana Taboada Barber. She's a professor and associate dean for research, innovation, and partnerships in the College of Education at the University of Maryland. Ana studies reading comprehension and reading motivation in emergent bilingual students. Her work centers on studying the influence of specific motivational and cognitive factors on the literacy and language development of elementary and middle school students. As a former English as a second language teacher, Ana's work in reading comprehension development is principally concentrated with the population of Spanish-speaking emergent bilinguals in the United States and in South America. Amelia?
Thank you so much. Just to set us up, there is wide recognition that the science of reading and the science of reading movement have served as an important catalyst, fueled by grassroots activism, educator networks, journalism. It has become a powerful vehicle for promoting improved and more equitable outcomes for students. But today is a very special day. We're going to expand upon theories and models frequently discussed in the SOR communities. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to you, Kelly, and I'm going to ask you to expand upon what is the science of reading to you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Amelia. I'm so excited to be with you all today to get to talk about the science. And for me, the science of reading is the vast, and really for all of us, it's a vast interdisciplinary body of scientific research evidence, and it comes from a wide number of fields. So cognitive science, education, of course, human development, linguistics, neuroscience, psychology, speech-language pathology, special education, and many, many more fields. And those fields have provided us research evidence that tells us how reading develops and how best to teach it. And with respect to instruction, which is, why we're all here and where our hearts are, the science of reading tells us which instructional practices work for our students to move the needle forward on reading achievement and which practices don't work. And that's important to know as well. In the case of word recognition instruction, for example, there's a robust research base that shows us that explicit systematic phonics instruction is essential to help our students achieve skilled word reading. And really understanding how the science applies to classrooms and what the science says works is going to help us meet the needs of more students, particularly those who struggle to learn to read. And I think that's what you're talking about, Amelia. But I want to say another thing about the science, because it's about getting that science into practice. And that's something that doesn't always happen. We see research advances, but we don't always see that research make its way into classrooms. And so when I work with my pre-service teachers, I'm always asking them, or with in-service teachers around the country, I'm always asking them to question practices they implement in their lessons as well as what they find in schools with a show me the data stance. My colleague Nell Duke has a t-shirt that says show me the data on it. And it's a great way to think about what it is we're doing with children. We should be confident that our instructional practices are backed by data from multiple sources. And research studies tell us, whether instructional practices can move the needle on reading achievement, but we've got to keep in mind that the studies are conducted with other students, not the ones in our classrooms. And so we need to pay attention to whether those practices are also working for our students. And that's why our own students' data are also critically important. So those progress monitoring data points that you get from your students to understand that whether those research supported practices are actually doing what we hope they're doing with the students in our classroom. So the science is evidence, broad research evidence, but we need to apply it in our classrooms and pay attention with other data, our own data, to whether those practices are working.
Kelly, I'm loving it already. And let's go on, Mario. But Kelly talked about data. My professors in my school psych program used to say, in God we trust, everybody else must bring data. So I'm with you. Mario.
Dr. Taboada Barber, what would you say is the science of reading for emergent bilingual students?
Sure, thank you. Very pleased to be here. Welcome everybody, especially people who are coming from all corners of the country. Very excited. I will aim to expand and whenever we don't defer often, but whenever I defer, Kelly and I have been working together for many years. I will say so. But just to expand or supplement what she said, I would say that when we're talking about emergent bilinguals, or formerly called English learners or multilingual learners, and I'm going to stick with one term for simplicity, emergent bilinguals, because I believe bilingualism is a continuum and it develops through life. We tend to think of the science of reading as mostly K through 12. And I very much agree with Claude Goldenberg and other researchers who have emphasized that we have to think of the science of reading also in the early stages and also beyond third grade when it comes to reading comprehension. And these two phases of development becomes especially important for emergent bilinguals. Why? Emergent bilinguals, and especially Spanish speakers, emergent bilinguals, who, as we all know, are the majority in our classrooms and in the United States of any children who speaks English as a second language, need to capitalize as much as possible in that first language. Now, the reality of schools tell us that that's not easy for teachers, and we definitely have a shortage of teachers, have way too much to do, need to focus on data. And, many teachers do not speak the many languages that they encounter, or even Spanish that they encounter in their classrooms. But it's important that teachers convey the message based on research and evidence that their first language, we need to think as creating momentum for strengthening their English development. Not only in terms of the foundational skills, because there's a lot of studies that have shown that there's a significant transfer from Spanish to other languages to English in phonological awareness, in processes of word decoding, but also in what we call higher order processes, the use of comprehension strategies, the capacity to make inferences, to monitor comprehension. All of those, if children have received an instruction in their first language, will definitely become stronger in the second language, in English. So for teachers, if they cannot teach in their first language, which again is the case of many monolingual settings, the importance of conveying to parents that the more children have the opportunity to develop language vocabulary early on, from the early stages in their first language, is critical for concurrent and later English development. And why is that important? Because we know that, to be clear and following the science of reading, the foundational skills, anything that has to do with development of phonological awareness, explicit phonic instructions, and so on, is critical for EDs. So that's a parallelism. We know that these children need this explicit instruction as much as they need oral language development. In fact, we also know that they tend to develop their and achieve their word decoding skills up to third grade in parallel with their English monolingual peers. But after third grade, that's when we see the dip. And I emphasize that just like I emphasize it for my students. That's when the struggles with academic vocabulary, not only everyday and colloquial vocabulary, but academic vocabulary makes itself very present. And we see the consequences in this children's reading achievement and reading comprehension. So if I had to say, what are some of the implications for these students? Oral language, definitely focus on the foundational skills, but let's not forget what are the key drivers of reading comprehension later on. And we're going to be mentioning some more of them. And at this point, I'll stay with the use of their first language early on when possible at home because of the transfer, but also oral language development in English in the preschool years as much as possible. I think I'll stop there and then I'll resume with other points.
Ana, you make me think of so much about the importance of a knowledge building curricula, right?
Absolutely.
Kelly talked about how different areas must come together. Cognitive science tells us how knowledge is built, right? So I can't wait to see where this conversation is going. But you talked a little bit, Ana, about what is missing from the conversation. Kelly, I want to turn to you. And what else do you think is missing from the conversation that is going on right now?
Absolutely. First, I want to make clear that word recognition and language comprehension processes that Ana mentioned, and like we see in popular views like the simple view and the reading rope, those sets of skills, and they're not singular skills, they are sets, complex sets of skills themselves. Both of those sets of skills are absolutely essential. And those models, simple view, reading rope, are absolutely on target and directing our attention to making sure our students have these things in place. And Amelia, you're absolutely right. Knowledge building is also essential. And that's, if you have ever, I'll just do a quick aside here. Ana works on the Knowledge Matters campaign. She's not going to tell you that, but I am. You should check it out. They're doing some fabulous work on building knowledge and what students need. So back to what I'm supposed to be talking about. So we know that we must learn to decode words skillfully in order to comprehend texts. If we can't lift them off the page, we're not going to understand what we read. And we also must be able to understand language, whether it's spoken to us, read to us, or whether we decode it ourselves. We've got to comprehend that language. But what the familiar two-factor views with these two buckets of skills don't really highlight clearly is that effective reading involves more than that. It involves more than just being able to decode words and understand language as two separate buckets of skills. They're not, we tend to think about them as being taught and learned and used separately, but readers have to do these things at the same time. We are deploying these processes at the same time as we're engaged with texts. So think of this, even if a child can demonstrate these skills when we assess them independently, if I give a child a decoding assessment and they do great with that, and I give another, I give that same child a language comprehension assessment and they can tell me about the story we read, or they are answering questions and understanding what I say to them. That doesn't mean that they can then deploy both of those skills at the same time when engaged with a text on their own. Skilled word recognition doesn't guarantee comprehension, and it doesn't guarantee that they can put everything together. It's sort of like that game that we played as children when we would pat our head. You remember this, and rub your tummy, right? And
Yes.
so we could do each thing separately. I can do that fine. But even as a grown-up, I'm having to really think about how to do both at once. And it's not simply a matter of doing both. We're having to engage this weird third coordination ability in order to manage these two things at once. And this is a very simple example, but I'm sure you've seen readers taking this into the realm of reading, where you walk into a classroom and they seem like they're decoding fine, but or they might engage in meaning-focused discussions, but when they try to actively engage these things at once, with a text, everything falls apart. And so that coordination piece, the fact that word recognition and language comprehension must be managed at once, and that they actually interact with one another and overlap and must be coordinated, that's an important piece, but that seems to be missing from our conversations. It's not just a matter of, hey, make sure they can decode with explicit systematic phonics instruction and make sure they can understand language. They still may not comprehend the text if they can't actively self-regulate and coordinate those processes. And that's the other piece I think is missing, that active self-regulation. So I'll stop there. I could get on a soapbox. So
we are going to stay with you because it's such a beautiful segue into the active view of reading. So can you expand a little bit, because you're right there. Why the active view of reading? Why now? Can you let us know what led to this beautiful, my favorite graph right now?
Oh, well, thank you. I just love this enthusiasm. Let me share really quickly. I'll share a picture of it in case listeners are not familiar with the active view. So there you go. I'll share that. Can you see it?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so my colleague Nell Duke and I developed the active view of reading to incorporate those recent advances, those things that are missing from current conversations that aren't really clearly represented in other popular views of reading. Now, that's not to say that the simple view, for example, doesn't intend that coordination. It certainly is a product, decoding times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. But looking at that model, it doesn't readily help us understand that there are many places where a reader must actually put these pieces together, okay? And what you see here in the model before you, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here we prioritize word recognition, that bucket of skills, and language comprehension. And we honor those and hold them up as supported by robust research bases that need to be in our instructional repertoires. Our students must get instruction in both of those sets of skills or buckets of skills, as I said earlier. But you see the purple, the overlap, the red and blue makes purple here. The bridging processes include skills that actually support both word recognition and language comprehension, like vocabulary, or they involve both word recognition and language comprehension, like morphology. Think about the word rereading. To be able to recruit morphological skills and think about those meaningful word parts, read, ing, you need to be able to decode the parts using grapheme-phoneme correspondences. And we know that morphological awareness actually contributes to word reading based in the science, but it also helps us to understand the meaning of that word. So by using your morphological knowledge and recruiting that knowledge, you're necessarily engaging both word recognition and language comprehension. And Fluency is a similar process because fluency requires decoding accurately, right, and automatically, while also managing the meaning so that you can render an expressive oral presentation of text. So we call these kinds of skills bridging skills because they really cut across both word recognition and language comprehension. And that second set of skills I mentioned earlier that isn't addressed clearly in other views of reading are those active self-regulation skills like executive functions, motivation, strategy use. These help readers drive their word recognition and deploy their word recognition processes, drive and deploy their language comprehension processes, and they also help them to coordinate them in the service of reading comprehension. And we based this model on instructional research, and it really leads us to ask questions like these when we're thinking about, let me go over here to this screen, when we're thinking about instruction, it leads us to ask things like, okay, do my readers have the word recognition knowledge and skills that they need? Do they have the language comprehension knowledge and skills that they need? Can they coordinate word reading and meaning focused processes? Are they able to put it together? And then finally, do they have the self-regulatory skills they need to manage word recognition, language comprehension, and bridge and coordinate those? And so what we see with the active view is that it guides us to attend to more factors that can support more students. And we actually tested this model recently in a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. A meta-analysis is a study that includes findings from many research studies. And what we did here was we examined studies that involve instruction in word recognition, studies that involve instruction in language comprehension, studies that involve instruction in the bridging processes, and then studies that involve instruction in active self-regulation. And so we have effect sizes here on this particular slide to show you a couple of things. One is that, of course, instruction in word recognition and instruction in language comprehension move the needle forward for our students. They help them to achieve significantly in reading comprehension. It helps to improve their reading comprehension in statistically significant ways. But what we also showed is that instruction, again, these were all instructional studies, instruction in bridging processes and instruction in active self-regulation improved reading comprehension for students over and above the contributions of word recognition and language comprehension instruction. So that really helps us to see ways that we might be able to target needs of students that aren't addressed in current conversations while continuing to support and address all of the needs we have been identifying in current conversations. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, and it's amazing to me the effect size of the purple, right? It's a pretty large effect size for us not to be talking about. And the way you talked about how the active view truly does inform instruction and the entry points to intervene with kids that are having more difficulty. I want to continue this conversation, but I want to move to you, Mario. What questions do you have for Ana?
Ana, we would love for you to expand on what the implications are for the active view of reading in terms of instruction, specifically for multilingual learners. Thoughts on that?
Sure. I think since we are captivated, and also one of the big contributions is that purple area that Amelia highlighted in the chat, and also that Kelly spoke about. I think that's an important area to focus on for emergent bilinguals, as much as we do it for monolingual students. Why? Well, we have work that has actually shown that mapping, that synchronization or coordination of processes is key. And there are many examples of those processes that help coordinate. But one of them is the ability of, because I mentioned oral language before and the importance of oral language for, since the early stages, since they are really young for emergent bilinguals, it's important not to forget the importance of explicit word decoding instruction. But what it's difficult sometimes for teachers, like anyone who's in the classroom, and teaching is an art as much as a science, is to strike the right balance between the time and how to integrate these processes or this instruction for these processes. So in this case, we're talking about that coordination that brings word decoding to oral language to word decoding, if you wish, and that is orthographic mapping, that automatic processing where sounds are mapped to letters and where that ultimately leads to fluent reading instruction. We find that many of our emergent bilinguals struggle not only with comprehension, but also with that fluent reading. So they may have fluent oral language, but that doesn't mean that they go directly into that fluency, which, as it's been traditionally called, that bridge between word decoding and comprehension. So that links back to why fluent reading is so important for all students, but especially for emergent bilinguals. Because ultimately fluent reading contributes to time spent on text. If kids are deploying constantly their cognitive capacity into decoding, we know they get exhausted, they don't get to the end of the sentence. Using comprehension strategies such as inferencing and figuring out when they don't understand text, monitor their comprehension is too laborious. Fluency is that all that facilitates going through text. Yes, they may not know the answer to a comprehension question, but fluency also is a big enabler for spending time with text, which leads to that knowledge building. Ultimately, what at the core of this Knowledge Matters campaign that Kelly mentioned earlier are identifying strong curriculum that focuses on knowledge development in all areas, in the content areas and in the language arts. But knowledge is developed through time spent reading. And time spent reading, one of the big facilitators is that fluent reading that can be situated in that purple area within the active view. So I would say that's a key component that we tend to not emphasize enough for students who later on have struggles with comprehension, such as our emergent bilinguals.
I am putting the Knowledge Matters campaign into the chat. They continue to look at curricula that do this well. They build vocabulary, they build knowledge, and they make sure kids know how to read well from the start. So far, 6 curricula have been identified, and American Reading ARC Core is one of them. So I put it there in case you want to take a look at it. But I want to go a little bit deeper, because both of you in your answers, you are tapping into something that people don't talk about enough. And the active view model kind of has this start from the left going towards the right with self-regulation. People are not talking about self-regulation, executive functioning in early literacy. Kelly, I'm going to start with you. What do people need to know?
This is a great question. And one of the things that we tend to see or out in the field is that looking at views like the rope or the simple view, where we know we need to teach the things that are prioritized in those models. So we're filling students up with these skills. If they don't have the skills, we make sure we teach them, but that's passive. There's not a role of children's agency in making reading happen. But when we walk away from reading instruction, we want to have these active self-regulated learners that can make reading happen, that know what to do when they get to a multisyllabic word, for example, that they have active self-regulation strategies that they can deploy to figure out how to sound out the word rereading or whatever, the multisyllabic word may be. You mentioned executive function skills. They are higher order cognitive skills. They're mental management skills. Many of you may have heard about these skills in child study meetings when you are, formulating an IEP for a student and the school psychologist comes in and says, well, this child has working memory problems, or they have executive function problems, or they have inhibition problems, as in the, children with ADHD, for example. But you may not have connected them specifically to reading. And so I'll do a little bit of that here. They're mental skills that help us manage anything in life, from going to the grocery store to reading complex text. And so they involve things like working memory. Working memory helps us to hold things in mind while we do other things. Hold mental models of text and meaning in mind while we're making our way through the text and updating that model. That's what working memory does for us. Or cognitive flexibility or mental flexibility. It helps us shift back and forth between sources of information. We might have to juggle between decoding and meaning making to make sure text makes sense. We might have to flex pronunciations of words. Think about the word wind, W-I-N-D. Well, if I'm reading about a watch, an analog watch, I might not be winding it. I may be winding it. And so I have to have knowledge that it's even possible to do this. And I need to be able to flex between different pronunciations of that vowel pattern and that spelling pattern. So that kind of flexibility is also important for both decoding and comprehension. Another one is inhibitory control or inhibition, that ability to stop and think. So in the grocery store, when I am ignoring, the attractive end cap of Oreos and not buying them, that's inhibition. But when a child ignores distracting information in the classroom or irrelevant meanings in a text, that also recruits inhibition skills. When we need to flex between word meanings, like in math class, when our teacher tells us to find the difference in math class, that means the answer in a subtraction problem. But in English class, we're comparing and contrasting, right? So the word means something different, and we have to flex between meanings and inhibit the one that doesn't fit the text that we're reading. Executive function skills are invisible, though, and we as educators, we're typically pretty good readers. We like reading. We got into education because learning and reading are things that we kind of like to do. And so we don't even really have access to these invisible processes that make reading happen, or these executive processes that we're deploying underneath those reading processes. So executive skills help us to make reading happen, whether it's word recognition, language comprehension, or coordinating them to make reading comprehension work. So tell me if that answers your question.
Yes, and I just love it because it makes me think about, Anna talked about orthographic mapping, but there's so much now being done also on statistical learning and set for variability. And I think putting all the pieces together is so critical for us to understand this. But the piece that you talked about, it makes me think about, again, going back to knowledge building curricula, where we don't jump from topic to topic to topic to topic, and kids get to experience multiple texts in the same topic and connect different ideas, not only across a text, but across multiple texts to then marshal and communicate evidence. So you mentioned so many things that makes me think about the pedagogical approach, Anna. If we are in front of the class the whole time, how are kids going to put all of this together, right? But the design of the curricula is so critical. So we sometimes are talking about all of the theoretical differences, and we're not getting to the kids and what the kids need. Mario, are you as excited as I am about this?
Absolutely. I think a lot of teachers and administrators are appreciating the bridging processes that link both word recognition and language comprehension, often that are seen separately instead of how to incorporate them together.
Now, do we have any questions, Mario, that must be answered by either Kelly or Anna before we go on?
There was a question about miscues by a friend of ours in the chat named Joan Hernandez Lindemann. And she says, I'm curious about the open quote, close quote miscues in fluent reading. Can the miscues tell us anything, or are they not useful, according to the critics of the cueing system? And we're going to invite any one of our experts to answer that question.
I think that the miscue word comes from approaches that have received a lot of press. I'll say it that way. But by miscues, I would say that those are misreadings of words in print. And what that tells me is that the child doesn't have the knowledge of the spelling patterns to actually decode the words on the page. So rather than, and I'll go back a little ways, as I'm a researcher and I'm a mom. So I have seen my children come home, having been taught things at school. And I remember my son being told, oh, it's okay if you can't read the words, you can read the pictures. Or if you get to a word that you can't sound out, like a long, multisyllabic word, it's okay. You can just skip it and then figure out what it means, as you read along, and he wasn't told figure out what it means, figure out what it is. And I would say that miscues tell us when a child hasn't been equipped with the knowledge of complex spelling patterns and those grapheme phoneme connections that they need. It's more than just A, B, B, C, K, and sometimes it's more than simple grapheme phoneme connections. We've got to teach complex grapheme phoneme decoding processes in order for children to access more complex text. And so if they are misreading or miscuing, if you will, in fluent reading, I would say it's not fluent, because fluency by definition is accurate and automatic. So if it's not accurate, then they don't have all of the graphophonological knowledge that they need to render an accurate automatic reading of text. And so for my son, who came home saying, he's reading to me and he goes, over a multisyllabic word. And I said, well, buddy, what's going on? What does your teacher say you should do when you come to a word that you can't read? Well, she just says, skip it and I'll figure out what it is as I go along. And I'm like, wait a minute, use your sounds. You know how to use your sounds. Oh, mom, sounds are for babies. So my eyes, got big there, but sounds are not for babies. Sounds are for everyone because we use them. But if they don't have that knowledge, I would say the miscue or misreading tells us that we maybe need to equip them with decoding strategies for things that they've missed. And that contributes to that automatic and accurate fluent reading.
And Kelly, if you don't mind, I added Nell Duke's article. She wrote an article that is my favorite article to expand on this, when young readers get stuck.
Yes, I love that article.
Right? It's so good. But she talks about, we must understand the processes that underlie the questions we ask.
Mm-hmm.
So there are appropriate questions for appropriate times. And so it's open source. So please read that article, because it really expands, it reinforces what Kelly just said, but also it expands on this topic. Mario, there's one more question that I believe we want to bring to our speakers.
Yeah, so I wanted to just add, first and foremost, thank you, Kelly, for expanding on how to use miscues to be able to better meet the needs of students. But a lot of teachers often try to tease apart the nature of where miscues come from. Are they language approximations? Are they literacy-based miscues? I wanted to invite Ana to expand on that question if you had anything else to add.
Sure. I think that question also relates to the other question that was posed on the chat, and that I think captures fluency, but also how to teach word decoding or foundational processes to EBs, to emergent bilinguals. Like as Kelly said, I think miscues can be telling it can be very telling for both EBs and emergent bilingual students, and monolingual students, but especially for kids who speak English as a second language or learn another, speak another language at home, of their decoding as much as their fluency challenges, right? So fluency, we think of fluency at the word level as much as at the sentence level and interparagraph level. So I think listening to children, as the question was posed on the chat, listening to emergent bilinguals read out loud in small groups. I'm not a big proponent as a former teacher, and based on research and observations of classroom instruction of popcorn reading, because that's highly anxiety provoking for many students, especially for those who do not have necessarily confidence in their oral reading. But or especially in the early grades, oral reading in small groups where teachers are active listeners, as the questions was posed of emergent bilinguals, fluent or disfluent reading is key to understanding. And again, going back to the first point that Kelly made, collecting data or information that is helpful for you to know where Juan is in terms of their decoding processes or their fluency. So I think that miscues can serve a very informative data point for teachers to guide instruction. Is the only guide for instruction in terms of word decoding and fluency? No. I think explicit word decoding and fluency instruction is key, just like it is for comprehension instruction, explicit and systematic. And the SVR definitely and the science of reading have brought those to the forefront for all of us.
Absolutely. Before we go on, I wanted, Kelly, you to talk about one more time, because I want people to walk away truly having like their elevator speech on how the active view of reading expands upon the simple view or the rope model.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So remember this, I'll do a little bit of a history lesson here. So the simple view of reading hit the presses back in the mid-80s in the height of the whole language movement, when decoding instruction was set aside. And so one of the primary purposes of putting that simple view into, it was in Reading and Special Education, a practitioner-focused journal, and it was helping practitioners to see not just that decoding is there, but that decoding is essential, because in that equation, D times LC equals RC. If decoding is at 0, kids aren't going to comprehend text. If they can't lift the words off the page, then they're not going to understand what they read. And so the simple view brought to us important and critical understandings about reading. And what the active view is doing is adding understandings based on the 35 years of research that have occurred since the simple view was proposed. And study after study, for example, shows that the overlap between word recognition and language comprehension is actually larger than the individual unique contributions of word reading and language comprehension alone in service of reading comprehension. So that overlap is there, but it's seldom discussed, and it's not addressed in conversations of the simple view. And I know that because the active view is newer than the simple view, there's been pushback where folks say, wait a minute, that's not based on science because it's not the simple view. Well, it's actually based on the scientific evidence. We proposed this view based on research studies that have been conducted since the simple view was proposed and that aren't easily explained by the simple view framework. And we wanted to make sure we incorporated attention to the fact that the readers have to coordinate and manage and integrate these processes, but also that readers' active self-regulation processes play an important and albeit invisible role in reading word reading, language comprehension, coordination, and reading comprehension as well. So it's those missing pieces, the bridging processes and the self-regulation processes that we are adding. Not that we're not trashing the simple view, we're building on that extremely important and critical foundation, but adding pieces that may be missing from the conversation based in that science. And the effect sizes from the meta-analysis that I shared with you earlier show from a number of studies the support for these extra new pieces that we hadn't been discussing.
Thank you so much. Mario, I'm so excited. I want to have them back like as soon as possible. We need more on this. I do want to make sure, because both of you talked about the importance of explicit, systematic instruction. And there's a parallel need, and there are also cross-language connections there that we can make. I do want to make sure that people understand. I have 2 3-year-old grandchildren, and of course they cannot read the word yet, but
It won't be long.
It won't be long, right? They are read to, and they talk a lot about books, but there's a difference between using pictures to make sense of the world and using pictures to decode. We should not be doing that. Sometimes beginning readers may turn to the picture to confirm something. And that's normal at the beginning, but what they do is different from what we should teach.
Yes, yes.
Right? There are behaviors that are natural, developmentally natural when they are early, pre-alphabetic readers. We need to understand what our role as instructors is and what do they need to move along the phases of word reading development successfully. I think that's really important. Kids do some things. That doesn't mean that that's what we need to teach them.
Great.
Right? Anna, do you want to expand on that?
Sure. I think the article that you pointed from Nell Duke also has a sentence or two on this, and this goes to the use of pictures in text, right? So pictures, no matter the age, they might help the younger learners, but they won't help with word identification or word decoding. They help with context, understanding of the context by guessing, right? And that's why the SVR has been so vehement and so systematic, to use the word again, in terms of documenting evidence that says the 3-cueing system, this guessing system, doesn't work with helping kids with the foundational skills they need. And the same applies to emergent bilinguals, to English monolinguals, early on and later on. What we see children, as you nicely said, Amelia, naturally doing, they will tend naturally to go, especially when they are young. We have tons. What do we use for vocabulary development and for oral language development early on? Lots of picture books with restricted text, right? That's part of the developmental trend that we, ARC and so many others probably have in their books, no matter the language. So yes, that's a natural tendency. Do pictures have to be used for word identification? No. Can pictures be used in explicit, there was another question, in an explicit way in the preschool year for oral language development? Sure. So explicit and systematic in relation to what and what tools. That's what I try to work with teachers. Sure, we need explicit and systematic instruction on a lot of the dimensions of reading. But ultimately, what is that dimension of reading that we're focusing on? And what tools or what materials are we using for? Right? What's ultimately the process? The process is not guessing words or decoding words by pictures. But pictures can be very helpful in terms of naming things and vocabulary development and oral language. So it's okay to use picture books early on in an explicit way and at preschool, right? Now, later on, to not encourage children to use pictures to guess from text.
That's, I love what both Nell Duke and Ari say, that when young readers get stuck on a word or attempt to guess a word, they should be encouraged to carefully attend to the letters in the word and
Mhm,
rely on their letter sound knowledge, right?
mhm.
When necessary, they
That's right.
can cross-check with meaning and pictures, but it's a confirmation. It's not an initial decoding.
Mhm.
It's very important that people understand the difference. I
Mhm.
do want, the time is going by so fast, Mario, I'm so sad. Is there another question that we must ask before we go on?
Yes, we
The
have a
group,
few. So there's a question from Tracy, and this friend goes, with the active view of reading in mind, how should we apprentice future teachers and leaders differently with this framework as a theory of action in mind?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. The active view is new, right? But it also gives us, here, I'll put it back on the screen. Hang on. I lose my cursor and then I can't put it back on the screen. But here it is. It gives us particular aspects of reading that we know can be changed with instruction in the classroom. And so it gives us places to assess our students. Do they have the phonological awareness that they need? Do they have the alphabetic principle? Do they link the sounds with letters? Do they have all of that complex phonics knowledge, and so on and so forth? So the active view does two things. One, it provides us particular specific places we can intervene, and there's places we can intervene beyond just word recognition and language comprehension, but also it helps us to understand that readers are actively having to manage and coordinate these things, and that their self-regulation skills matter, and that they're important, and they're helping to drive reading processes. And so I think as a framework, it helps to prioritize or underscore the complexity of reading, rather than thinking that reading is simple, because we know that even though it's easy for us, and I can pick up a book and I can read a journal article to you, I can read a book and I understand these things without having to think about it, but it's not easy or simple, even though it feels simple to us because we're not seeing those invisible processes. And so I think what we're trying to do here is make the invisible complexity of reading visible in instructionally relevant ways.
what I hear you say is that although the simple view might be an easy way for an initial conversation,
Mm-hmm.
must take people to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise,
Yeah, the simple view is an essential way to bring people to the understanding that decoding must be taught, that it must be in place. And as a tiny aside here from the neuroscience perspective, that orthographic mapping that Anna brought up earlier, where we're linking phonemes and graphemes together, those letters and sounds together with meaning, so that words become sight words. When we teach in that way, it's not just helping them link those things in memory. It's also building the reading network in children's brains. So explicit systematic phonics instruction and making sure that we're equipping children with that explicit systematic knowledge, not memorizing sight words. Memorizing doesn't do it. Big chunks of words, looking at shapes of words, it doesn't do it. It's the attention to the letters and sounds, even in irregular words, that helps to build that reading network in the brain. And we're building brains. And we didn't know that in the 80s when the simple view came on the scene, but we know that now. We're building brains that will help them to be good readers as they continue on through life.
Thank you so much. And I know we are running out of time. There are a couple of questions that I will send it to you. One is from our deaf and hard of hearing community. I'll send that to you so you guys can have some time to think about resources that might be helpful. But Mario, I want to finish by asking both Anna, I'm going to start with you, and Kelly. What are you excited about and currently working on? What should we be looking forward to?
Should I start?
Yes, Anna. We'll
So
start with you.
I'm going to say that there's lots to be excited about, and part is a little bit of what we see as missing as reading researchers, what we see as somewhat missing from the SVR, and we discussed those, and I will mention two things. One that I mentioned earlier, and that I think it's particularly important for the population of students I work with, emergent bilinguals, and that is that piece of oral language that ultimately links or leads to later on to knowledge building. And the other one is reading motivation and reading engagement, right? Just like we're building brains, as Kelly said, and we focus on all the cognition, a big part within self-regulated reading is that reading motivation. And we shouldn't be only looking at it as a trait, that children are motivated. Yes, sure. Early readers get excited about decoding a word. But as time goes on, kids become very automatic, hopefully, in their word decoding, and what excites them is knowledge building and learning from text, building knowledge from text. So how to weave in reading motivation and practices that support motivation in the classroom is key, and not to see motivation as a trait. I've been excited about that for a long time, and I'm more excited within the larger, or the view of the active view of reading and the science of reading. And in particular, within our common work, I would say I've been studying emergent bilinguals for a long time in English-only settings. Now we have the opportunity to work with these children and teachers in bilingual settings, and we're looking at how executive functions, how do they leverage those executive functions to strengthen not only their bilingualism, but their reading in both languages? Because there's lots of studies that have shown that, and we want to see how does that take shape for Spanish emergent bilinguals. I'll stop there. Thank you for the question. Very excited.
Exciting. I'm excited too. Kelly, what about you?
Oh gosh, I couldn't agree more with what Ana was talking about. And I want to make a minor point. Well, it's not a minor point, it's a big point, that we all as educators want children to love reading like we do. And that's why I have a shelf of favorite books over here. We bring our favorite books into classrooms and we want them to love reading. But children won't love reading if they cannot lift the words off of the page. So teaching them, even though grapheme, phoneme decoding seems effortful and hard at first, that is what's going to enable them to feel like they can lift any word off of the page. The kids who are struggling to read are not able to enjoy it. And so one of the things Ana and I have been looking at is reading anxiety. We know that children who have trouble reading the words actually are significantly more anxious than others. And those are pieces that aren't really addressed. Other things that I'm excited about are unpacking reading specific ways, like that set for variability, that executive functions undergird and support our reading processes. And I'm also excited about working with a colleague, looking at what the brain's doing as we're engaging in those kinds of tasks. And so we have better ways to do the science now, and we have more insights on what's going on with our readers, and we're able to unpack specific instructionally relevant ways that our executive skills can help support them do that.
We are just scratching the surface today. And you do have an article that is open to anybody that wants to read, that we posted in the chat. It's going to be in the follow-up email. But that is a foundational article that requires close reading. It requires a lot of connections across the article. So it's a good test for us on our executive functioning. Just saying. Yes. But I want to finish, and Mario, I don't think we have time for questions, but I want to finish by giving both Ana and then Kelly a chance to talk about what was left unsaid that is really important for people to remember?
Shall I start again? I pause, of course. I think what is left unsaid, and I'm not talking about the content itself, is that from a former teacher and a mother, as much as a researcher angle, so the three, I would say, is how much teachers do.
Oh,
Putting a lot on teachers. And I know teachers throughout the country, those that are here are proof of that as well, are trying to learn as much as they can, integrate the science, make sense of it, and do what is best for children. It's not easy. If I were teaching at this point, I know I would feel overwhelmed. Take it in stride. You know, reading is complex. It's a complex process. Follow the science as much as you can. I think what's left unsaid is acknowledging the effort that teachers are making. And I thank them. As a mother, I thank them because I see the efforts. So we have a lot to be excited about. We know a lot. The science, as Kelly said, has come a long way. So I think I'm gonna just say thank you to teachers. That's what I think we should be saying more.
absolutely. And I'll build on what Anna said by just saying that what you do as educators is critically important. You're not just building brains. You are providing children access to the thing that sets them up for a good life. Reading literally lays the foundation for academic success, career attainment. Low literacy predicts poor health, low mental health, likelihood of criminality and incarceration. I mean, poor reading, low literacy sets us on a trajectory of disadvantage. And so what we do in applying the science in classrooms in ways that meet the needs of the students in front of us, no matter who they are, no matter where they come in, that equips them with what they need for future success. So you're changing lives, and it's very much appreciated.
Thank you so much for your presence today. I'm going to turn it over to Mario, but I'm telling you, I want more. I feel like my cup is only half full and I want it everything. I want to know everything. Mario, what comes next?
Thank you, Amelia. So I'm going to share my screen to shout out our next national webinar, details to come about that. But I also think it's a great opportunity for us to acknowledge the work, Amelia, that you've done in creating our national webinar series. I know I speak from everyone in saying we love you so much, and we thank you so much for engaging these critical conversations with our practitioners in the field nationwide. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.